to the third RISIS Research Seminars. So you know all our academic activities are moved online, and so we thought it's a good moment to offer this series of seminars. They are related to the Research Infrastructure for Science and Innovation Policy Studies project, and deal with subjects in research policy, higher education studies, innovation studies, which are broadly related to the RISIS research programs. And for those who are not in RISIS, RISIS is an infrastructure project, so its core is to make available new data or better connected data on research policies. And we wish to present some exemplary cases of research which can benefit from RISIS. Today it will be RISIS related research, but the seminar series is open to everybody who would like to present in the future, even from outside RISIS. Now I have the pleasure to welcome our today's presenter, Martina Neuländtner, she's a scientist at the Austrian Institute of Technology in the Center for Innovation and Policy. AIT is one of the main partners in RISIS, and she's currently working on modeling and analyzing knowledge creation in regional innovation systems. She has a master's degree in economics from the Vienna University of Business and Economics, and she's attending a doctoral program in social economic science at the same university, with a focus on economic geography and geography innovation. And she will present exactly about research and development networks and their effects on heterogeneous modes of knowledge creation, leveraging on two specialities of AIT, one their large database of funded European projects, and the other one their spatial econometric approach. I will give the word to Martina, and then we will have a discussant, Rune Fitjar from University of Stavanger, and then after his reply or comments, we will open the floor for general discussion. Some rules. First, you have seen the presentation is recorded. It will be made available on the website. Second, you are kindly requested to switch off your microphone and possibly your camera as well to save bandwidth and to have a more calm environment. I will moderate the discussion, so please post questions, or simply you want to ask questions, to make comments in the chat, and I will give you the word. And at that moment, you open the microphone and you open the camera, so we have the pleasure also of seeing your face when you are talking. All that being said, I want to thank the organizers from CNR, Serena Fabrizi, Alessia Fava, and Emanuela Reale, for their supporting work, and give to Martina the word for your presentation.
Thank you very much, Benedetto, for the introduction. We are very happy to present you today recent work of ours on the role of R&D networks for knowledge creation, where we obviously extensively made use of the RISIS data infrastructure. I would also like to welcome our discussant Rune on our behalf. Thank you very much for joining us today. It really is a pleasure. So welcome, Rune. Okay, without further ado, I will dive right into the presentation of our study, and this is joint work with my colleague from the AIT, Thomas Scherngell, and he will also participate in the discussion afterwards. And I will talk about R&D networks and their effects on heterogeneous modes of knowledge creation, and we have done a spatial econometric perspective. We mainly have 2 points of departure for this study. First, knowledge is unequally dispersed across regions, and second, knowledge is heterogeneous, and so are knowledge creation processes. The first point is quite well backed up, for instance, by the geography of innovation literature, and becomes also quite obvious whenever you look at the distributional map of almost any measure of knowledge creation, for instance, patent applications or scientific publications. Here, the interest of scholars lie in investigating how knowledge can be assessed from various points in space to overcome these geographical barriers in creating new knowledge. And this highlights the role of R&D networks as channel for cross-regional knowledge flows. Regarding the second point, the heterogeneous knowledge and the heterogeneous knowledge creation processes, at least the empirical evidence is up to now quite scarce, and existing studies are mainly conducted at an aggregate level, for instance, neglecting different modes of knowledge creation. And these different modes of knowledge creation refer to specific characteristics of the knowledge creation processes. And this is the entry point for this study. We acknowledge the important role of R&D networks for knowledge creation, and we estimate the impacts of such networks. We take a spatial econometric perspectives where we focus on knowledge exploration versus knowledge exploitation, and on the differences in terms of the quantity and quality of the knowledge created. Why do we take a focus on knowledge exploitation and knowledge exploration? We use knowledge exploitation exploration as a framework to characterize the heterogeneous processes of knowledge creation. And this categorization is nothing new and is quite well established framework, and it was originally brought forward by March in 1991. Since then, a lot of scholars have applied this framework and this categorization and have adapted it also to a lot of different contexts. And following March, we define exploitation and exploration the following. We understand exploitation as application-oriented and mostly within an industrial setting and targeted towards product development while making use of market knowledge. On the other hand, we define exploration, or what we understand about exploration it's more scientifically driven, and it's mostly occurring within an academic setting. And its focus is on research activity in research projects, which is in scientific publications. What is very important to note here is obviously that knowledge creation activities are neither fully exploitative or fully explorative. So it's often a mix of those two types or even more types. So when we speak, for instance, of exploitative knowledge creation, we actually mean exploitation-oriented or exploration-dominated knowledge creation. This is important to remember when we are discussing the results. So it's a bit of a mix of exploitation and exploration, but we consider or try to distinguish between exploitation-oriented and exploitation-dominated and exploration-dominated or exploration-oriented knowledge creation. For the data and scope, obviously we had made extensive use of the RISIS data infrastructure, and it was a really valuable instrument for us where we got the data for our analysis. And we had the patent applications and the scientific publications to proxy exploitative and explorative knowledge creation. And to measure the quantity and quality of knowledge creation, we used the patent quality index and also the mean normalized citation score. I will elaborate on the variables a bit later in more detail, but we got the scientific publication and obviously also the quality measure for the scientific publications, the mean normalized citation score from CWTS, and the R&D networks that are based on European Framework Program data, which we retrieved from the EUPRO database. Both databases are within RISIS. In total, we have 270 European NUTS2 regions in our model, and we're estimating a so-called spatial Durbin model. Before we go into the more detailed model description, we want to give you an idea of a spatial econometric modeling and an idea of a spatial econometric perspective. Spatial econometrics is a subfield of econometrics for observing relationships in spatial data, dealing with the issue of spatial dependence, which is also known as spatial autocorrelation. The problem with spatial dependence is that from a statistical perspective, it violates the modeling assumptions of independent observations. And this is quite a strict and quite important as modeling assumptions for many statistical models. And this leads to biased estimates if we would not account for the spatial dependence in our model. So explicitly taking into account the spatial dependence structure, as in, for instance, a neighborhood structure in the regression model, we would have a methodological inconsistency. And by explicitly taking it into account, this spatial dependence, we could account for this methodological issue. And moreover, it's not just a statistical reason why we have a spatial econometric perspective. We can also observe and quantify interdependencies between neighboring regions and also between so-called spatial spillovers or externalities which arise due knowledge interdependencies between regions and their neighboring regions. So let's turn to the econometric model we have estimated. Note that this is a fairly general spatial Durbin model that we have presented here. The model follows a knowledge production framework, or is in the vein of a knowledge production framework, and hence it has on the left-hand side, the Y is typically a knowledge output. So it's a vector of a knowledge output, or in our sense, it's a representation for different modes of knowledge creation and different types of knowledge output. And on the right-hand side, in the X, we typically have a matrix with knowledge input variables. And what is characteristic to a spatial Durbin model is the inclusion of a spatial lag of the dependent as well as the independent variable, which is here indicated with a capital Y times the Y, capital W times the Y and a capital W times the X. What is understood as a spatial lag here is exactly this multiplication of a dependent or independent variable with a so-called spatial weights matrix, which represents a neighborhood structure or some kind of structure of spatial dependence. And specific to our model is that we also include variables that represent regional network embeddedness in our explanatory variable set. What is worth to note is that this spatial Durbin model is estimated by means of a maximum likelihood estimation, which is less sensitive to heteroscedasticity, which is existing by definition in a spatial Durbin model. And we also cannot interpret the coefficients resulting from the spatial Durbin model as they are, but we need to calculate some kind of impact measures because of feedback loops and spatial multiplication issues, but we will elaborate a bit more on this later. Let's turn to the variables. We have a set of dependent variables since we measure four different modes of knowledge, two different modes of knowledge creation and two different types of knowledge output. So we need four different dependent variables representing these dimensions. To represent the quantity aspect of knowledge creation, we have the region share of patents and the region share of scientific publication to represent exploitation and exploration respectively. And to measure the quality aspect of knowledge creation, we have the patent quality index and the mean normalized citation index to reflect exploitation and exploration respectively. The patent quality index is constructed by Squezzerini et al. and it's a composed index of patents forward citations and patent family size and the number of claims and the patent generality index. And so we have kind of a reflection of technological importance, geographical scope, and a technological breadth in this patent quality index, measuring quality of exploitation, of exploitative knowledge creation. And the mean normalized citation score is a very commonly used state-of-the-art scientific impact indicator, and it's a measure of quality aspect here, and it's defined as the average number of citations per publication normalized by year and field. Our variables are averages over a period of from 2013 to 2015 to reduce the effect of yearly variations, and they enter the model in a log transformed form. Now let's turn to the independent variables. Obviously, and first and foremost, we have included network variables to measure regional knowledge, regional network embeddedness in different ways. So first, we have the region's degree centrality. The degree centrality is defined as the number of collaboration partners in a European framework programs in this case, and is hence a measure of direct influence and reflects direct access to other regional knowledge domains. A second variable we tested the effect of region's authority, which is measured by the authority score, and it measures kind of the intensity of a region's interlinking with other central regions. And so it measures indirect influence of collaboration partners, or in other words, the indirect access to collaboration partners. To some sort, it reflects the access of a higher order, since it represents connectedness to central regions that are themselves also well connected to other central regions. Of course, we have a set of control variables which are all inspired by the knowledge production framework, which is the R&D intensity, the human resources, the population as a control for size, and the specialization as a control for the sectoral structure. We have here averages from the period from 2007 to 2009. You see we have here a gap between the independent and the dependent variable to take out at least some effect of heterogeneity in the model. As I've already mentioned briefly before, we cannot directly interpret the coefficients resulting from the spatial Durbin model, but we need to calculate so-called impact measures. And we can have a total impact measure that comprises a direct impact and an indirect impact. We have a direct impact that is defined as a change in a certain region associated with any given explanatory variable that affects the region itself. This also includes the impact passing through the neighboring regions and back to the region itself. So this is why we cannot just take the coefficient. We also have this feedback loop being an effect that goes through the neighboring regions coming back to the region itself. This is the direct impact. Then we have an indirect impact, which is the spatial spillovers. So this is the effect of neighboring regions, or more generally, more proximate regions on the region itself, but the effect of the neighboring regions. We can interpret these effects as averages, so we can have an equivalent to coefficients in the interpretation, or we can look at these effects on an individual level and on a region-specific level, which we will see later. Maybe a short note on the formula stated here. We have basically the direct, total, and indirect effects, and we have the matrix S of W, of capital W, which is nothing more than the partial derivatives of a given explanatory variable. So we have partial derivatives as impact measures. And we have the diagonal of this matrix, which are the direct effects, and we have the off diagonal, of this matrix, which are the indirect effects. And so the formulas are nothing more than we have here the trace of this matrix, which is the sum of the diagonals as the direct effects. And we have the total effects, which is the sum of all matrix elements of this partial derivative matrix. And of course, we have the difference between the total and the direct as the indirect effects. On the next two slides, I simply want to discuss the significances and the direction of the effects. And I will go into much more detail on the effect of the EU-funded networks on a different slide a bit later. We have estimated basically two models, one including the degree centrality as additional explanatory variable, and another where we included the authority score. For each network measure, we estimated the effect on exploitation and also exploration. First, we are taking a look at the direct effects separated by knowledge quantity at the top and quality at the bottom. To remind you, the direct effects are the effects of a change of a specific dependent variable in region I on the region I itself, including again this feedback loop through the regions back to the region itself. Turning to the results for quantity. In general, we can find positive and significant effects for all determinants included in the model, except for the degree of specialization at the very bottom and the effect of degree centrality in the case of exploitation. So authority, R&D intensity, human resources, and population have, not surprisingly, a positive effect on both modes of knowledge creation. The degree of specialization is found to have no effect on the quantity of knowledge. And interestingly, the degree centrality is also not conducive for the quantity of exploitative knowledge creation. In other words, the number of direct collaboration partners has no effect on the sheer number of patent application. Also, the effect of authority is relatively low on the exploitative knowledge creation. However, turning to the quality part on the bottom of the slide, we indeed find a relatively strong effect of the number of collaboration partners on patents of high quality. Also, the effect of authority is the highest compared to other models. So there seems to be a big difference between the quantity and quality of exploitative knowledge to be created in terms of the effects of R&D networks. In general, for knowledge quality, we find positive and significant effect throughout all modes of knowledge creation and types of network link structures. The effect of authority is considerably higher than for degree centrality. This is also the case for knowledge quantity. So we have much higher effects of authority than for the degree. This is true for both exploitation, exploration, and quantity and quality. Regarding the other determinants, interestingly, for the quality part, for the quality of knowledge creation, specialization is indeed, oh, sorry, I switched the slide. We are still at the direct spatial Durbin impact effect. For the quality part, it is very interesting that we find a significant effect of specialization, while we had for the quantity part no significance. So specialization is indeed a positive impact, has indeed a positive impact on the quality of knowledge creation on both modes of knowledge creation, exploitation and exploration. Okay, let's turn to the indirect spatial Durbin impact effects, which are the spillover effects from other regions, from neighboring regions on the region itself. We were interested if we find any spillover effects, spatial spillover effects from R&D networks or R&D network effects, but we don't find any. So what does this tell us? Neighboring regions that are themselves strongly and well connected and hence have access to external knowledge have actually no impact on the knowledge creation of their neighboring regions. So there are no positive spillovers from network connectivity or embeddedness. And we will see what this will tell us in a policy conclusion context a bit later. However, what we find is a significant spillover effects for R&D intensity, for the case of knowledge quantity, and for human resources for knowledge quality. In other words, knowledge quantity is affected by neighboring regions' R&D intensity, and knowledge quality is affected by the neighboring regions' human resources. And this is actually a quite interesting differentiation, considering the effect of money, as in R&D expenditures, versus skilled personnel on the on the quality of knowledge creation and the quantity of knowledge creation. So R&D intensity of neighboring regions seems to drive the quantity, as in human resources in neighboring regions seems to drive the quality of knowledge creation. The direction of the effect of human resources is quite straightforward. It's positive and significant, but the direction of R&D intensity is not so straightforward. We also find a negative effect here. This points towards a quite strongly spatially concentrated knowledge creation activities. So especially here for the quality part in the exploitation, on the exploitative knowledge creation, we have a negative effect in the R&D intensity. And this may be due to our measure of quality here, but it's also the case that we could have quite strongly spatially concentrated knowledge creation activities here. So we have a high activity of explorative knowledge creation, for instance, in a specific region, and only quite few activities in the neighboring regions. And this is why there's a negative effect on the R&D intensity in indirect effects here. Okay, let's talk a little bit more about the impacts of EU-funded networks. So about the effects of the R&D network measures, we have estimated the degree centrality and the authority score. In general, what we can say is that we find a significant positive impact on both exploitative and explorative knowledge creation, but the estimates differ across the knowledge creation modes. For knowledge exploitation, we find generally a higher network effect on the quality of knowledge creation rather than the pure quantity. And on the other hand, for knowledge exploration, network authority seems to be specifically important for the quantity of knowledge created. So in generally, network authority, which means being connected with other central partners, has a significantly higher impact on all modes of knowledge creation than degree centrality has, which represents only the pure number of partners. This tells us that it's very important to easily branch into different knowledge domains by means of other central interregional collaboration partners. And this also supports the idea that tapping into heterogeneous knowledge networks is conducive to knowledge creation. And as already mentioned, spatial spillovers are insignificant for network effects. So simply being co-located to well-connected other regions, neighboring regions, is not conducive for the region's knowledge creation itself, no matter which mode. So I mentioned briefly that impact estimates cannot be only interpreted in their average way, as we did for the direct and indirect effects earlier, but they can also be interpreted on an individual and regional level. So we can also calculate the region-specific impact measures. And what we have here displayed are the total effects, the total impact measures as a percent changes. And this is just an example, or two maps as an example for the quality aspect and from the authority score. So this is the effect of the region's authority on their knowledge quality. And we have here on the left-hand side the map for exploitation, and on the right-hand side the map for exploration. On the first side, we can see a slightly different distribution of the authority effects for knowledge exploitation and exploration. And for the case of exploration, in general, more regions show relatively higher effects. And nonetheless, the effects for exploitations are generally higher than those for exploration. And interestingly, also to note, just for the degree centralities, the maps, they look quite similar, just a bit different in terms of the sizes of the effects, but the spatial distribution overall looks quite similar, also in comparison to exploitation and exploration. Generally, we can see that for both modes of knowledge creation, certain regions benefit more than others of authority, of having an authoritative position in the network. So these are, for instance, regions that are close by economic hubs, such as Rome or Brussels. But interestingly, it's not only those regions, it's also regions, neighboring regions of Bratislava and Bucharest that are amongst the regions that benefit the most from being embedded in a EU framework program, in collaborative projects in the EU framework. And what is quite interesting, what we found is that a lot of UK regions take an exceptional position here. A lot of UK regions benefit quite a lot from EU-funded networks. So apart from Greater London, we have especially a region in northwestern England, and about 10 of the UK regions are amongst the top 20 benefiters of EU-funded networks here, what we find. So as a matter of fact, this is quite ironic that the UK regions, in terms of considering the discussion about Brexit, actually benefit a lot from the networks and having an authoritative position, in this case, in the networks. To summarize, EU-funded networks are in general a significant driver for both modes of knowledge creation, what we find, and there is a higher positive impact of networks on explorative knowledge creation for the quantity of knowledge output, and a higher positive impact of networks on exploitative knowledge creation for the quality of knowledge output. Moreover, we find differing individual region-specific network effects, where some regions particularly benefit, in particular many UK regions. So this leads us to a quite alarming conclusion with respect to Brexit. UK regions actually benefited quite a lot from EU-funded networks, but this access is now strongly restricted. This may be also interesting for other potential future exiteers, since the consequences could potentially be quite severe also for them, what we see in the case for the UK regions. And a second policy relevant conclusion is based on the fact that there is no evidence for spatial spillovers from network effects. This means that there are no positive effects of network relations of neighboring regions on a specific region's knowledge creation. So simply being co-located to strongly connected regions is not efficient, since there are no positive spillovers in that sense. So there is a need for active policy measures that should be targeted toward developing region internal network capabilities. And for instance, they could strengthen network critical R&D infrastructure such that the regional research actors are able to connect to international and leading research hubs. So these are two policy conclusions that we derive from our results. Let's come to some limitations of our study. And first, obviously, the results rest on the choice of the R&D network. And in our case, it's the EU-funded collaborative projects from the framework programs. And as we all know, the framework projects follow certain rules, they follow certain rationales. So the interpretation of the results is limited to this kind of R&D networks. Second, aspects of knowledge quality could be highlighted in much more details. Obviously, there are a lot of aspects and a lot of measures, a lot of indicators how we can measure knowledge quality. And we have only decided for two measures. And for obviously, there is a lot more future research to do that we can talk about generalizability of such effects or of such network effects also for other types of knowledge quality. Third, we have now estimated a static model, and the dynamic perspective would also be very interesting for the future. And finally, the RISIS databases are emerging and advancing a lot and steadily, and especially if it's going into the direction of sustainable development goals, this may open new possibilities for studying also field or technology-specific network effects. This would be interesting to have the much more fine-grained results, considering also technological heterogeneity in knowledge creation. And maybe you have some further ideas for future research as well. So far, I would like to thank you all for your attention, and we're now ready for the discussion.
So thank you, Martina, for an excellent and very interesting presentation. So I would like to give the word to Rune for his feedback or rebuttal, or I don't know. The word is to you.
Thank you. How long do I have for this?
So if you take 10 minutes, it's okay.
Okay, perfect. So thank you, Martina. I think this was a very impressive paper and very impressive analysis. It was a great pleasure to read and to go through your material. I would like to start a little bit on the theory side. This notion of exploration and exploitation, of course, it's frequently used, and overall I buy that there is a distinction along the lines that you indicate, that there are indicators that you have that point more towards exploration or exploitation. But I still think there are a couple of issues with the conceptualization of those two. So the first of my questions would be, so you conceptualize exploration and exploitation as modes of knowledge creation. From my view, it's not really about creating knowledge. It's more about searching for knowledge, maybe. So a company or an individual might explore for knowledge or might try to exploit knowledge that they have. So either in exploring for knowledge, you search broadly for new knowledge. In exploiting knowledge, you use the knowledge that you already have. So in that sense, there are different things that you can do with knowledge in a way, and I'm not sure that to what extent they are kind of modes of creating knowledge, or whether they are indicators of something else that you do different things basically with knowledge. So that would be kind of the first question in relation to that, and then the second one would be, so the way that you measure these, I'm not sure to what extent they are actually maybe rather measures of who it is that creates the knowledge. So your measures of exploitation seem much more directed towards networks and relationships that firms are involved in, whereas the one for exploitation is much more about, for exploration is much more about what universities and research organizations do. So in a way, it seems both the outputs and the type of networks that you have are measuring the role of different types of actors within the region. So in one case, the industrial networks that the region has, and in the other case, the research networks that a region has. I don't know if we should maybe, you might want to respond in turn to the different comments that I have. So maybe that's kind of enough.
Maybe it's better that you make all your comments,
okay,
and Martina will be given back the word.
Okay, that's fine. Okay, so then the second point I have about your theory is basically, so you have quite a complex empirical story in terms of the findings that networks have different effects, not just on exploration and exploitation, but also on the quality and quantity of exploration and exploitation. And I'm not sure I'm kind of fully convinced that you have a theoretical argument for this. So it seems to me that these findings are mainly driven by the empirical results. And in order to kind of derive strong policy implications, I would like to also have maybe a stronger theoretical motivation for why it is that networks would have different effects on quality than quantity within each of these modes of knowledge. So I think motivating the overall hypothesis better is something that I would really focus on. Then also I think kind of partly theory, partly methods. So you have of course a strong spatial econometrics framework, which is really driving a lot of what you find, I think. I'm not entirely sure that you have motivated this in the theory section, and there is kind of a I don't know if a conflict or I mean, in a way, your theory is about proximity in networks and not about proximity in space. So you talk a lot about spillovers moving through networks, moving depending on whether the organizations are connected through the networks, whereas the spatial econometrics model measures to what extent there are spillovers to neighboring regions in space. So by your theory, I would expect these knowledge spillovers to flow through the network, that the knowledge that you create is basically spilled over to neighboring regions in the network rather than neighboring regions in the geographical space. And to that extent, I'm not sure that kind of the choice of a spatial econometrics approach really flows naturally from your theory. And I think also when you then come on to conclude that basically network spillovers don't really matter, so you don't really find spillovers on geographically neighboring regions, then I think that's also kind of the natural implication of that in a way would be to simplify the model, basically to not have the spatial spillovers in the model. So I can understand, of course, why you want to use the spatial econometrics model, and I think there are convincing arguments that there are geographical spillovers, but I'm not sure that you have motivated it enough in the paper. So I think you would maybe require a stronger anchoring in the theory for that model. Then moving on to your results, I think some of the coefficients are definitely not what you expect, especially for the control variables. So one is the effects of R&D intensity. So first of all, you find stronger effects, stronger direct effects of R&D intensity in both models for exploitation and exploration. And I think by your theory, you would expect the opposite, that exploration is a more R&D heavy activity than exploitation. So that is something that is a bit unexpected and I think would need to be explained. Secondly, these negative spillovers that you find, both of exploration and of R&D intensity on exploration is I mean, it's something that you discuss a bit in the paper, that you also discussed in the presentation. I'm not sure I'm kind of fully convinced that this is about whether there are by accident neighboring regions that are either highly or weakly R&D intensive, because I think there needs to be also a theoretical explanation here. So there's something here about how a region doesn't, the R&D investments in one region doesn't spill over to neighboring regions, but rather there is a kind of backwash effect that it taps from neighboring regions. So I think that's something that needs to be explained. The same goes for this negative effect that you find of human resources on the quality of exploration activities. You talk a lot about the differences in effects between the different models. I would like to know whether those differences are statistically significant. So when you compare the models, I think it would be interesting to see whether those are just different estimates of the effects, or whether they're actually significant also in order to make the conclusions that you do. So some kind of formal significance test on them would be helpful, I think. It's also not quite clear to me to what extent the scales for quality and quantity are comparable. So are they measured on the same scale? And to what extent can you say that basically because one coefficient is higher than the other, that the effect is therefore stronger in that model? And then the final comment, so I was looking a bit at the OLS results that you also put in the appendix, and also some of the correlations. So you have a really strong correlation between the quantity and quality of patents, 0.98, which is essentially saying that it's pretty much the same variable that you measure there. And then still you find quite different results in the empirical analysis. Those differences in the results are quite specific to the spatial econometrics approach. So if you look at the OLS approach, then the results are not very different, and they are more or less the same in the quality and quantity model. So this really kind of makes it important that you have a good motivation for the spatial econometrics approach that you want to take. So I would like also your comments on that, kind of why do you find so different results when the variables are so highly correlated, and why do you find so different results for the spatial model versus a simpler OLS model? Thank you.
Thank you, Rune. Martina, it's your turn, and then we open the floor for a general discussion.
Okay. I spilled my tea. I'd also invite Thomas Scherngell to enter the floor if he wants to comment on any of these questions and comments. There are quite a lot, and I hope I got them all with taking notes. So if I don't, please correct me. And
that's the goal of these seminars, to get you presented challenges.
So the first point was theory-wise about the modes of knowledge creation and the motivation, or how, if you're actually measuring or having modes of knowledge creation, or if it's just exploration going towards the search of knowledge, and exploitation is rather the use of knowledge. And if we take the correct term of calling them modes of knowledge creation, as March did. When I did the theory or research on the theory, there were quite a lot of conceptualizations going around this exploitation and exploration. And it was taken in a lot of different contexts, and also including spatial levels and on a firm level, on regional levels, and it was taken in a quite heterogeneous way, and a lot of people were dragging the notion of exploitation, exploration in a lot of different ways. And what I did is I tried to make sense of all these different conceptualizations that emerged from March and tried to bring them under one umbrella. And maybe it was not the best way to call them modes of knowledge creation, or it measures something different than it actually does, but I've still we can differentiate between basic or applied research, or what they call it else, but in basic they are, a lot of them have a common core of these different conceptualizations, and I tried to bring them to an intersection in this common core and called it exploitation, exploration, and it's more application oriented or more scientifically oriented, stemming from universities, knowledge coming from universities, knowledge coming from firms. And this is also kind of targeting or reflecting upon your second question. Is it rather what who does create the knowledge, the firms or the university, was what we measure? It's part, of course, it's part of that as well, because we have application oriented or scientific oriented, and of course it's more driven by a firm network or the knowledge output of firms, patents, and it's and exploration is more driven by the output of universities and research organizations. But this is also what we stated and what we did take into the definition of what we understand of exploration, exploitation. And what I also want to note again is that we cannot speak, or we also don't want to speak of explicitly having just exploitation or exploration knowledge or knowledge creation, but it's always a mix, so it's oriented. So basically it's most of the knowledge creation activities are targeted towards exploration or exploitation. It's not that it's completely separable, going into two different directions. It's just one way how we try to conceptualize it, and we speak also of exploitation oriented and exploitation oriented or dominated. And we think that it's dominated, exploitation is also dominated mostly by firm knowledge in an application oriented setting, and exploration is dominated by knowledge coming from universities or research organizations within a scientific surrounding, within a scientific environment. I don't know if this did answer any of your questions, but it definitely does make me think about how to conceptualize or how to call it, or if we should frame it in a more concise way, that it also targets the things you mentioned on who is creating the knowledge, if it's actually knowledge creation and not about search or use. But Thomas, maybe you want to add something? I saw you.
I just wanted to add, I think it's you have perfectly explained, Martina, but I think Rune made a very good point about the search process, and I think we have not stressed it. I do not really see the problem, because searching for knowledge, I would say in the widest sense, is also part of the knowledge creation mode, I would say so. But if we take this element more on board that you have mentioned, Rune, in the theoretical derivation, in the theoretical motivation of the approach, I think this can greatly benefit to make it more clear what referred to by the concepts here. I mean, the other way, we have discussed a lot about it, of course, would be also to simply say scientific knowledge creation, because it is proxied by publications, and technological knowledge creation, which would be, so to say, the standard way in the literature. But we wanted to put it on a more abstract level, relating to earlier literature and innovation economics, that starts with March 91, where we stress this overlapping between these different modes of knowledge creation and the different emphasis that these two modes have. And I think by adding this idea about search, that it's very important to stress whether the search mode is more explorative or exploitative. I think that this gives a very important dimension to this discussion that we can add to the paper, Martina.
Sure.
Hey, thank you. I would like, Martina, are you finished?
With the first two questions, yes.
Yeah. Because then I would like to give the floor to the audience for some questions. I have comments on my side as well, but I'll ask them later. Thomas?
Yeah, just thanks for the very interesting presentation, Martina, and thanks Rune for the extremely valuable comments. I mean, all of these 4 points will greatly improve, and they are good to be handled. Also, the theoretical motivation of the different network measures. We have, for instance, authority will be good to access complementary pieces of knowledge that you can in a better way integrate in your own knowledge creation process. We have not stressed it sufficiently yet in the theoretical motivation of the paper, so this can very well be integrated. Also, the spatial econometrics you mentioned, we have just motivated statistically, because we are economic geographers and we know when we have regions, we have to do it. It's not possible to do it without, because we think we have the statistical reason for it, which is important, but I agree that we can at the same time motivate it theoretically better. And also some strange results, as you call it. I think there are some issues that we can a little bit discuss under the umbrella of brain drain things in the case of exploration, and this is something that we can possibly highlight to explain some of the negative autocorrelation that you have also spotted in the results. I think some of the results you have spotted are also just in an earlier version of the paper that are now not anymore in the presentation, but I think, Martina, this is something that probably you can, I'm not sure about this. I have 2 other general remarks. First, about RISIS. Of course, this is a study that would not have been possible without RISIS, in particular in terms of integrating this publication and project data. So this is really, from my view, a good example where we can show what this infrastructure can do. And you see, I think it's one of the first studies showing that, and this is what we have debated in theory, but we have no empirical systematic evidence for it now, that networks in technological knowledge production are specifically important for improving the quality of knowledge production, not only the quantity. And that's something I think that's debated in theoretical considerations, but there's no systematic evidence now, and this becomes possible. But also the future research path that we have discussed about, looking at different technologies, looking at different policy relevant fields, or one important point for future research that I would say, how are these network effects conditioned by other intervening factors? So now we have looked at it separately from other control variables, but it would be interesting to interact these network effects, how these effects are conditioned by human resources, by R&D expenditure, and other knowledge relevant resource variables. This would bring this also to a new dimension, which is possible with the data sets we have now prepared in RISIS. Yeah, these were just some general remarks from my side.
Thank you. I would like to give you some remarks on my side. So I found it interesting, and maybe unlike Rune, I find the idea of rooting in some more general concepts like exploitation versus exploration is attractive, because might bring you, I think this was the intention, to go beyond the usual studies of impact of European framework programs, which you did many times. I have a few problems or a few remarks. One is about the consistency across the paper in what you are doing, or what are your aims. So if you start a story about exploration versus exploitation, you theorize about exploration versus exploitation, and you give a convincing mechanism why European networks should have different effects on the two, and then that's the focus of your paper. Then when you go through the paper, it comes up the spatial econometrics perspective. I agree with Rune, except you are publishing a journal where this is required as a baseline. There is no real motivation, and your spillover effects are not overly convincing. So one would ask, if your focus is exploration versus exploitation, why you don't use another method, because you have other problems empirically, and then you use this as a robustness check of spatial spillovers, for example. At some point, when you go towards the end of the presentation, it looks like an impact study of European networks, if I read your concluding slides. So if you have to do a paper, the paper has to be on one topic. And I really find exploration versus exploitation might be attractive, but then you need a convincing mechanism or a theoretical mechanism why you expect similar or different effects for the case of R&D networks. Otherwise, it's very difficult to sustain your results in terms of robustness. This brings me to the second issue. I really think you need to work on the empirics and the measures. Because if you think, we know that participation to European framework program at regional level is mostly determined by size and their intensity. So the variables you are explaining are the main predictor of your independent, assumedly independent variables. And since you have high time correlation between these variables, the fact that you simply use time lags is not a cure, because the time variance is too slow, and your predictors at 2009 are so correlated with your predictors in 2015, then you have too much endogeneity. So I do think you need to take this seriously. For example, it would help enormously if you could use only publication and patent associated with European projects, because then the endogeneity with the variables you are using will be less. So you have a more clear causal mechanism. Because the obvious comments I would have is there are all kinds of networks around in science. Observing one network is correlated to some extent to scientific collaboration networks, to other kind of networks, and then you have no control on that. So maybe if you could, for example, use as measure exploration, exploitation generated by European project, and this might be possible, this would strongly reduce these problems. So you have two approaches to reduce this problem. One, to be convincing on the theoretical mechanism, and you don't have it now. And second, to improve the measures. And in that sense, I found what you showed on differences in regions in the effects was interesting, because I might say why, for example, Paris is not benefiting of European framework program networks. But the reason is that they are so central, the region is so central in all kinds of networks that there is no additional benefit beyond the fact that you are already central, whereas maybe there are regions where there are effects. So you might think about this point. My last comment is about the spatial dimension. If you keep the spatial econometrics framework, I wonder whether a large part of the absence of spillover effects is not related to the regional structure you are using, because NUTS2 are very large and very heterogeneous. You have both rural and urban regions. So to think that the whole Lombardy has a spillover effect on Veneto, it's for me not so obvious, whereas I might think that being proximate to Milan makes an impact. So I think if you stay on the econometric regions, NUTS2 is not a good level. And you might know, Thomas knows, in NOMAC, we had a better classification, and we find out, because I know the problem is R&D intensity, which is not available in Eurostat at NUTS3 level, but we believe that we can approximate R&D intensity at NUTS3 level. So these were my comments. Maybe I would like to give the floor for comments from the audience and then give you back for a response. So I see Lozano who had comments. Martin? Martin, yes, are you here? He's here, but okay. So otherwise, I see Nicola Dotti having a comment. Could you open your microphone and repeat your question? I think it's better.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, thank you for the presentation. I apologize because I missed the very first part, and it was just the introduction, so I really appreciate the work. I think it's very interesting, the idea of combining the spatial perspective, so from spillovers and multiplier effect, with the idea of being more or less central in a network. So the principle of authority was the idea of including that indicator. For me is very interesting. I was quite intrigued at the work more on the policy side, on when you were saying that you were surprised that the British regions were benefiting a lot. We know that the UK is a major beneficiary of Horizon 2020, in general of the EU funded. And one of the questions that we were addressing in a study we did for Belgium was to wonder what if, in case of Brexit and the various scenarios that were under discussion, which regions are more likely to benefit. I know it's a bit of scenario drawing. There are currently on the table 3 different scenarios depending on the share of funding the UK will be able to get it. But I think it relates a lot on the idea of the diffusion, because what I really like in the presentation is that it's not only the various way of having exploration or exploitation, but also that European regions, well, we already discussed the difference between NUTS2 and NUTS3, and in general, I really appreciate the fact that you explain the different impacts and the different benefits of EU-funded research across Europe. And Brexit will be clearly the major change in the future framework program. So I will be curious to have your view, which probably goes beyond the paper, but maybe you have some thoughts on what would be the impact of Brexit on the future Horizon Europe. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. Then I have a question by Ana Gomez. Ana, are you here? I don't see her anymore. So I read the question, okay, but it's more a comment. It says knowledge creation output theory should be studied by qualitative perspective. And this is one way. So if she's not here, I cannot say more. Are there other questions from the audience or comments? If not, I would like to give back to Martina and Thomas for your comments and reactions.
Okay, thank you, Benedetto, also for your valuable comments. They all partly overlap with those from Rune, so we will really stress these comments in the future version of our paper. So they triggered you both, apparently. I don't know if I'm getting all the questions right now, but I will try. First, Benedetto, you were talking about the theoretical background that we need to consider more or establish a bit better why we would expect different effects of networks on different modes of knowledge creation. And I agree with you that it might be come a bit short in the presentation, but is elaborated in the paper the presentation is based on. So maybe this was a missing point in the presentation, that we did not quite well elaborate on the effects we were expecting and why we were considering that there are different effects on the exploitation and exploration of the R&D effects of the R&D networks, also on the quantity quality, which is the point Rune targeted or highlighted, that we also need to have a theoretical foundation on why we expect R&D networks to differ in their effects on exploitation and on quantity and quality of knowledge creation, which is a well taken point. And if it's not already stated enough in the background study we have done, we will certainly focus on it a lot more, because it's a very important point. Then Benedetto was you were also talking about the framework, or kind of the direction the paper is going and the presentation is going. Is it's just about exploitation, exploration, and then we were talking about EUFP projects and the effect of EU-funded networks. This was a twist that we took for the presentation, or that I took for the presentation, to make it more, to get a better idea what these R&D networks could be or are in our case. And we take R&D networks as quite an abstract way, but of course it's empirically driven R&D networks, and these networks which we take is EU-funded networks. So we actually can talk about EU-funded networks and the effect of EU-funded networks. We don't have to be on an abstract level talking about R&D network effects, which is fine for the paper, but we could also transfer the knowledge of R&D networks, since we have EU-funded networks, to have an idea on the policy context of the rationale of EU-funded projects, and have ideas and make it more maybe likable, or maybe you can grasp the results better if you have kind of an idea of what kind of network could it actually be, or what kind of network it actually is in this case. So this is why we focus on the effect of the EU-funded networks, which is actually just our proxy for R&D networks. Then your point on endogeneity is well taken, Benedetto. It is quite an issue, and we try to get rid at least of some sort of endogeneity by taking the gaps. Of course, you can never get rid of all the endogeneity. So I agree with you, and we will think of how we could manage it. And your approach of taking just patents and publications that are associated with the EU projects is very well taken, and is a good idea. And we might think about that, and we will see of how this does change, how the results are going to change if we would have that. And of course, the networks are highly correlated, but they're actually, or they are assumed to be highly correlated. But we did take a look at some correlations, and it's not about 0.9, but it's about 0.6 or 0.7 between the correlations of publications or patents and so on. So we thought that shouldn't be a problem. But of course, the endogeneity issue still remains and should be taken care of as good as it can get. Then your remark about the spatial classification, then that's two regions. And you already mentioned that we should, or you are suggesting that we're going to use metropolitan regions that were created in NOMAC. And this is a very valid point. We did choose to not take metropolitan regions in this for this particular study, since we really did take not all measures that we wanted to have are available for metropolitan regions. But of course, this could be an advancement of the study to look also at metropolitan regions, and if specifically the region-specific effects that we calculated differ. So this could be a really interesting additional point that we will take up, certainly. Then the next comment about the UK regions and the effect of Brexit. And I'd like to take or make more precise how the specific effects emerged in this sense, and how the different effects in the spatial context emerged. So the effects, they are highly dependent on the location, on the position in space. What are the neighboring regions? And they're also highly dependent on the proximity and of the spatial proximity and on the network structure of the spatial network structure, so to say, the spatial dependence and the spatial autocorrelation. So it's not only about the effects of the R&D networks, but it's also an effect where they are embedded, where they are positioned in space. This is how the effects came up to. And apparently UK regions are very well embedded in other UK regions, obviously, and the neighboring regions, they have an effect, and it's the total effect, it's the direct and the indirect effect, so it's their own effect and the effect of the neighboring regions, and this is why they come up with strong effects of authority or degree neutrality. Maybe that as a side note on how to interpret these region-specific effects. And apart from that they really benefit from being embedded, from having a central position in the networks due to their spatial position. I cannot give any other policy recommendations or any other clues why the effect of Brexit would be, but it's obvious that they have a positive effect and they benefit relatively to the other regions quite a lot. So if they really would cut all the funding resources and they couldn't participate anymore in collaborative research projects, this would certainly have a severe effect on their R&D landscape, especially since they benefit quite well, or quite a lot. Thomas, do you have something to add or something to add?
Not so much. Thanks, Martina. I just want to add one reflection about what Benedetto said, this very valuable comment about the idea to look at publications and patents coming out from the framework programs directly, which is of course quite interesting, but probably shifts the study in a different direction, which is also interesting. What you have said before, that you like about the study that it is more at an abstract level and not one of the impact studies. Of course, when you go in that direction, it would come closer to this impact story when we directly take patents and applications out from the projects, because the goal of this study really is to take a broader view where we use R&D networks, EU-funded networks, just as a proxy for R&D networks in general, and how these R&D networks influence the knowledge production capabilities and mechanisms of different kinds, so exploration versus exploitation in the regional system. And by this we try more to connect to the debate, for instance, about innovation ecosystems and so on. But this just underlines the weakness you have mentioned, that this topic is not 100% homogeneous discussed throughout the whole study. That I fully agree. So we need to keep this consistency then in the whole work, which is not done yet. Exactly.
Thank you, Thomas. There are other comments from the audience. So if not, I have to say it's an immense pleasure to have this kind of scholarly debate, even if we are all working from home. So, and presentation and discussant were really excellent. So it's really a great work which shows the potential, and this was also the goal of these seminars, to give a lively academic debate and to challenge the presenters with many comments. So I found it really excellent. So thank you very much, and thank you also to the organizers at CNR. And I remind you that this series will go on. So we have one seminar per month. So the 9th of December, same time, we will have a presentation by Martin Visser from CWTS on comparing data sources for bibliometric analysis and pros and cons of using different sources. The invitation will be, the announcement and the invitation will be sent out shortly. So I really hope all of you are there. And I remind you, RISIS has also other activities you can find on the website. There are policy seminars more oriented to policy implications of RISIS relevant research, and a number of training courses on methods, on databases, on analysis based on RISIS data, and all of this you find on the website. So if there are no other comments, I think we can close the meeting, and wish you a pleasant afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody. Bye bye.
Ciao, grazie. Ciao, ciao.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye bye. Thank you.
Emanuela, bye.
Emanuela, bye.
Goodbye,
Bye-bye.
Daphne.
Bye.
Goodbye.
Bye.